93.7 FM, 600 AM KIVA, Fox News Radio, worldwide at abq.fm. You're listening to Life Imagined with one of your favorite hosts, Dr. Summers. Dr. Summers, welcome into the Kiva this wonderful Saturday.
Oh, it is just fantastic. I mean, fall around this place is just absolutely amazing. I mean, a touch of color and then just skies that are just to die for. And, oh, the moon. The moon has been great the past few days. My gosh. Well, anyway, yeah, it's another beautiful day here in Albuquerque. And, yeah, how are things with you, Langston?
Things are, it's been a hectic week.
Yeah. Have you been looking forward to your socialized medicine?
I have not been looking forward to my socialized medicine. I was told that if I liked my doctor, I could keep my doctor.
Yeah, repeatedly.
And I would like for that to be true.
It ain't true. There ain't no free lunch. That's the real
there
problem.
Isn't.
Yeah, I was just...
and there's a 6-month wait for a doctor here in New Mexico. And I have premium insurance, too.
Yeah, right. And then, well, I mean, let's go back to the good old days. When I was a kid, you would go see your doctor. It would be a $10 or $15 charge, maybe $30 at the outside. And you know, depending upon the doctor, some doctors let their practice run them, and some doctors ran their practice. And the ones who ran their practice, they'd be on time. And you would have half hour time. Now you've got 8 minutes or less. And the whole time the guy's looking at a computer or the gal's looking at a computer screen and barely listening to you. And it's a totally different world. And what's happened is you put a third party in between the patient and the doctor. And what I find fascinating is when you go back to 1965 when Lyndon Johnson went out and dramatically signed the Medicare, Medicaid laws into place at the Truman Library in Missouri in front of Harry Truman. Harry Truman hated Lyndon Johnson. But he showed up for that one. Well, Lyndon Johnson was a bit of an interesting individual. There are those who, to this day, think he was responsible for Kennedy's death.
Wow.
But, the conspiracy plots, and, we've got our conspiracy plots with this van and the pipe bombs and all that stuff, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. Anyway, so at the time, the legislation very clearly states that the federal government in the Medicare Act guarantees that they will not in any way interfere with the doctor-patient relationship. Now, Langston, let me ask, do you feel that your government is not in any way interfering in the relationship with your doctors?
Oh, yeah, they're totally not getting between me and my doctor. They absolutely are. That's how I feel.
Yeah, no, it's 100% control. And when you paid your $30 to see your doc for that half hour back in the day, that was written on a piece of paper. That piece of paper was sealed away by your doc, and nobody had access to that unless, they were on a need-to-know basis, like your spouse or your children or your parents or something of that nature. That information wasn't dispensed. But today, with the electronic medical records, everybody is signing these HIPAA things. And I've actually read, in fact, a group of us read chunks of the Obama law, but we also read the HIPAA regulations that came out in 2003 was when they got enacted, even though they were passed back in the 90s. I mean, that's a typical political trick. You will pass a really bad bill, and then you'll put it that goes against the will of the people, and then you'll have it implemented years after you're out of office.
Yes.
So the thing is, in 2003, HIPAA came in. Well, now everybody is, oh my gosh, that means I hate Aunt Gertie, and Aunt Gertie can't talk to the nurses or the doctors unless I give her permission. And that's where they get you focusing. What they don't tell you about is there's a back door under HIPAA regulations where your medical records are totally open to the government. Now, if I know your medical records, I can sure as heck do a lot of things to you, not for you. And it really is a form of control. So HIPAA regulations, they're not really for the people. They're for the government.
And they are pretty strenuous. I mean, when I worked for a mental health center, that was a really big deal, having to deal with the HIPAA in all sorts of ways that there are potential violations, from just the most simplistic taking of notes, or having a conversation with someone who happens to overhear, all sorts of different
Yeah, but if somebody shows up with a badge or an attorney, a federal attorney, they just simply give their credentials and then they grab up the records if you've signed the HIPAA form. And my recommendation to my patients are, when you go to the emergency room, they say, here, sign this HIPAA form, and they don't debate it or tell you what it means. You just refuse to sign it. In fact, the other day I was in a doctor's office for a little accident I had over in Flagstaff, and the staff there said, well, here's your HIPAA form. I said, I don't sign HIPAA forms. And, well, then we're not sure we can see you. I said, you better read your HIPAA laws, because your HIPAA laws say you're going to see me even more now that I refuse to sign the HIPAA form. And they acceded to it. But, yeah, I wanted to, and this, I think we'll try to make a feature of the show from time to time, talking about what it is to have socialized medicine. It doesn't mean that your caregiver is more social. Some people think socialized medicine means you're more social, you've got more friends on Facebook or some silly thing like that. No, what it means is it's, frankly, dictatorial or despotism running your health care. Or, put another way, it is the DMV running your health care. And if you don't believe me, ask veterans who go out to the Veterans Administration. So here's some news briefs from Utopia. In the UK, euthanasia is illegal, but hundreds and hundreds of patients are being reported of being dehydrated to death in the National Healthcare Service every year. What that means is they just don't feed them and they don't give them any fluid. And that's said to be in the, quote, best interest of the patient to die based on vague criteria.
Didn't this just happen recently with the young child, right? I think his name was Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie.
It was a very big deal. I mean, it was such a big deal that even American politicians, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, Ben Sass, Mike Lee, Cory Booker, and some Democrats as well, commented on this and were outraged at a child that was going to be killed, and he wasn't even allowed to go to Italy, where the Pope had said that he would pay for the entire treatment for the child.
And the child was treatable. They had made a decision within their health care that it was okay to go ahead and starve the kid to death and actually dehydrate him to death. They don't give fluids, and you die in about 3 to 7 days in that neighborhood.
My gosh.
And the parents, I think, got caught slipping fluids to him. But this isn't just in England, in UK. I have someone I knew whose mother went back to Holland and was still an American citizen, but she was subject to Dutch health care, and she had a stroke, massive stroke, which here we would treat, and within 6 months to a year, you would go through rehab, and you would go ahead and take your antihypertensives and live another 10 years, another decade or so. But in Holland, what they did was they gave her 3 days to walk, eat, and drink. And with a massive stroke, you've got to initially support them with IV fluids, et cetera, and the Dutch simply didn't do that, but notified the family that she was in their version of hospice. Their version of hospice is they just cut off all food and fluids and wait for you to die. It's just like being tossed on a raft in the middle of the Atlantic. And it's, when you talk to survivors of Auschwitz and places like that, the worst way to die was starvation. So their purposely, their benign way of giving a super late-term abortion, I suppose would be what they would call it, is to simply withdraw supporting fluids. Anyway, so that's now commonplace in the UK. It's been commonplace in Amsterdam and the Dutch health system for some time. Now, in Ontario, Canada, the great Canadian health care, there is now hallway care. And here's a case of a patient who was in the emergency hall room for 2 days on surgery for multiple fractures and a lacerated kidney, probably from an auto accident. And one hospital in Toronto had a peak occupancy rate recently of 147%. What that means is the patients are being stuck in the hallway. 3 to a room, so forth and so on. Let's see, France, another utopia. The French hospitals are threatened by, President Macron stated without changes, their hospital system will totally collapse. And he's proposing more doctors for rural areas. Why? I mean, who wants to go to medical school anymore? Rethinking the system's organization has been promised by the French government because their health care is in crisis. Now, in Europe, where everybody holds up this example of socialized medicine, how wonderful it is, they keep forgetting that the Europeans for the past 50 years have had no military budget. They don't have to pay to raise an army to defend them. We have done it for them. That gives them discretionary money to do social experiments such as socialized medicine. And now that they're having to cut into their budget in other ways, it's beginning to collapse. Anyway, one other notice from Utopia. There is in England national health care, which is, of course, rationing and doing the hospice that we just mentioned. But for the past 4 years, there have been private medicine has been allowed in England actually the whole time, but it has grown massively in the past 4 years because if you work for the national health care system, you can actually, in your insurance, see private doctors.
Right. Yeah. That isn't that how that always works?
Yeah.
That's about how that always goes, right? If you're part of the state, if you're a sitting politician, if you're a doctor within the state healthcare system, let us make exemptions for you and your family. But if you're a tax-paying, hardworking citizen, we're going to subject you to all of the ridiculousness that our terrible system has to offer. That really does seem, Dr. Summers, to be the pattern.
Yeah, if you want to see a healthcare system that looks like what I grew up with as a kid, go hang out in the Beltway, in the areas around Washington, D.C., where all of the government workers have their health insurance, which is the way it was for everybody in the United States 30 years ago, where basically the cost of health care was so low, you paid for it yourself, and the only thing you carried was what was called major medical. Mm-hmm. So if you had a bill that was above $10,000 or $15,000, $20,000, you were insuring for that, and the cost of that insurance was so low, it was incredible. Now, the middle class are the ones who are getting totally screwed in the healthcare system because your premiums are so high, your deductibles are so high, that you can't afford to use it. You know, it's just, I don't know. In the system.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that what we're seeing here in particular with healthcare, the difference for the general population, what the Beltway gets, is this really anything other than just control?
It's about population control. It is, people don't want to admit it, and they want to trust Big Brother, but the truth is Big Brother can't be trusted. It's too much power in the hands of the government to let them have your healthcare information. Anyway, just my thoughts on the thing.
No, but I think that's true. I mean, think from the perspective of the Second Amendment, right? You now have all these arguments in Florida, Washington, different states where certain mental health things would disqualify you. If a family member feels that you are a potential threat, they can get a court order to seize your firearms. In some places, if you have a history of depression, if you had an incident of suicide, if you suffer from bipolar disorder, any number of things will disqualify you in many states for owning a firearm. When you think about a single-payer healthcare system, where your mental health and physical health is all tied into one system that some government bureaucrat no doubt can gain access to, I mean, what do we think happens when you go through a background check to purchase a rifle and you're 45 years old, and when you were 15 you had an incident of depression, and so now you're being disqualified to own a firearm? I mean, I don't see how you can view a single-payer healthcare system as anything other than a means of control.
Yeah, exactly. And, here's the funny thing about that. No doctor in his right mind would ask you whether you had a firearm when I was a kid. But today, increasingly, you go into an emergency room, you get quizzed on, do you have a firearm? Next question is, where do you store it? And all of that goes into that electronic health record that the feds have their access to. so they know where to go to collect your guns if you answer truthfully. And again, HIPAA non-compliance, I think, should be the way the people act out against the government. Just refuse to sign the HIPAA. And it's built into the law. They still got to take care of you, whether you sign HIPAA or not. And I think that's the one way to start the protest wave. The real question is, you've got medicine probably 60 to 70% socialized at this point. And let me speak to the dangers of that. Remember, the original cradle-to-grave healthcare was invented by the Germans, Chancellor Bismarck, back in the 1890s, okay? So fast forward 40 years, and the physicians, the medical community was quite accustomed to obeying whoever paid the fare. And, it's the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules.
Right.
And so it was the government that was paying for all the health care. So whatever the government wanted, they got, never mind what the patient wanted, okay? So now we come into the Second World War. We have a medical community that's accustomed to listening to the government. The government is a Nazi government, and they have enemies, and they use the healthcare system to get rid of them. And, the German medical community went right along with it. You need to divorce the government integration with healthcare. It's too dangerous. 2-3 generations from now, it'll be like what I saw in Russia when I went in Russia in 1992 as part of a committee to look at what the communist government had wrought in the medical field. The hospitals were empty except for when you were just about to die. That was the criteria to go in the hospital. If you wanted to know what was the healthcare system, I was in St. Petersburg in late June. In late June, it's what they're called the summer nights, K-N-I-G-H-T. But the sun basically doesn't set. It goes down for about a half hour around 3 in the morning, comes right back up. That's how far north St. Petersburg is. So I'd go out for a walk or 1 or 2 in the night, and it would be almost like daylight. And I'd be going down these empty roads because, remember, it was trying to recover from communism. It was only 1 year after the fall of the empire. And the roads would be empty, virtually no cars or anything like that. And there would be these little kiosks with lines. And so I was curious what they were. And the kiosks were where you would put down 10 rubles and you would get a fifth of vodka for the night. And they were just selling it like they were selling hotcakes. And that was your health care in Russia. You just drank yourself to death.
You just need the vodka.
Yeah, you just need, as the Russians say, vodka is no longer for just breakfast anymore.
This is now your state health care.
Yeah.
Is now going to be getting bits and pieces of vodka. That's it.
Yeah, and and in these elegant hotels or shabby hotels that were their version of elegant in 1991, vodka was offered for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For breakfast. I kid you not. It would be right on the table.
My
There's
gosh.
a bottle of vodka and the coffee, and the water was undrinkable in St. Petersburg in those days. I mean, it's improved immensely. I was there last year, and I'm invited to go back next year, but I'm not sure I will. Anyway, so the thing, when I wish somebody had sent an email in trying to defend socialized medicine. It's indefensible. And the government intrusion is just never ending. And I don't care whether it's Republicans or Democrats, the politicians want too much power, and power over the people comes through control of the medical system. Furthermore, when you go back to when I was a youth, medicine was around 4 to 5% of the GDP. What is it today? It's around 19%.
That's right.
When they
It's a
get
huge
finished
cost.
with this baby, it is going to be minimally 25% of the GDP. That means $1 out of $4 spent in this country is going to be spent in the healthcare industry, so-called. And that's just outrageous. It really needs to get back around 5 to 7%. Well, how do you do that? You privatize it. I mean, can you think of any other way to get the government out of something?
Well, I mean, that really is the solution. I mean, when we think about the cost of healthcare. Why is healthcare so expensive? And pretty much any doctor and even healthcare administrator will tell you it's because of government. There's so much. I mean, for some hospitals, sometimes their largest expense is administration. And especially when they deal with Medicare and Medicaid, the number of staffers they need to get through paperwork, the number of healthcare administrators they need to get through the red tape, the number of lawyers and professionals they need to understand, the different regulations, and that balloons and absorbs this massive cost. You look at medication, the lack of competition within medications. When government authorizes a handful of guys to manufacture medications, keep these massive costs for entering into the market so high to create new medications.
Yeah, the number is $2 billion to get a new drug through the FDA. $2 billion.
That's insane.
And the multiple is you have to earn that money back in 5 years before the FDA lets your competitor on. Okay, so that means you have to make your $2 billion, you have to spend $1 billion or so to market it, and then you have to have $1 billion or so for profit for the investors for the company. And then you also have to set aside some money for the next blockbuster that you're trying to get. And I keep thinking President Trump is focused on the cost of medicines. I'm not sure that I agree with what I understand of how he's going about doing it. But one way I would put in the mix is the FDA has a monopoly on Mother May I, whether you can go to the market or not. And I think what you need to do is break that monopoly up. I think you need 2 or 3 chartered private companies that you can go to if you don't like the FDA and get your drug reviewed there. And what that'll do, I mean, right now, drug companies are paying in the neighborhood of $100 million processing fee. That's an above-the-table bribe. Langston. And, there's a history behind it, but I'll just say that the FDA earns, I think, like 40% of their budget is earned above the table with these user fees that they impose upon people. And again, if there was competition, you would say, okay, I can either give my $100 million to the FDA to process my drug, or I can give $50 million to company A that'll do it for $50 million and we'll get it done in a year, as opposed to the FDA that for $100 million will get the drug reviewed in 8 years. That's 8 years off your patent.
Which is insane. And quite frankly, and this is probably where I venture a little bit more toward the laissez-faire and libertarianism, even though I'm personally a nationalist. I
like that nationalist label. That's good.
To me,
it works.
that's what I say. But I'll put it like this, right? If I go and buy a pair of pants from one brand, and I put these pants on, and they're supposed to fit, and they rip or break or whatever within a week, or they fade, lose color, I'm not going to purchase from that brand anymore because I've tried the product, it doesn't work for me. The same thing with, in my mind, a doctor or medication or whatever these regulatory boards may be that limit the number of doctors or limit the number of pharmacists or limit the number of medical companies that can produce certain products. Allow the free market to fail or succeed. No one's going to buy medication from a company where 5 people have died. Mm-hmm. No one's going to do that, no matter how cheap it is. Like, no, that guy's selling lead. I'm not taking that. It's absurd. Okay? That person naturally will be phased out of the market. Of course, you don't want anyone to die, but I mean, when you think about how many people end up dying or end up having medical complications due to medications now that go through the FDA or regulator.
The FDA doesn't own a crystal ball that they can see the future. All they do is they just keep delaying, and then their assumption is if they delay the approval in these studies that what'll happen is that the side effects will come out. But the truth is that their studies are in pristine groups of people who are on no other medicines than the medicine for the disease they're trying to treat. And as a consequence, when they put it in the real world where people are on numerous other medicines, that's when you begin to see the side effects and the adverse effects. So their whole design is phony and fraught with difficulties. And there have been any number of drugs that have made it all the way through the FDA process, get out there, all of a sudden it's killing people because it interacts with a commonly used drug or some other factor they hadn't thought about, and it's pulled from the market. I just think the easiest thing to do is make a fast pathway to approval, get it out there where it's in the real world, and then put all your money into post-marketing surveillance. Make it easy to report adverse effects. Well, they're finally doing that to some extent, but it's too little too late. Anyway, so we're into the show. We're talking about single payer. I will say that the Democrat Party openly states that that's what their target is. In fact, if you look at the tapes around Obamacare, the whole idea was for Obamacare to flop and fail, and then everybody to go, oh my gosh, it's failed, isn't it awful? Mm-hmm. Who can fix the problem? Well, the cost of medicine has gotten so high, there's only one group that can fix it, and that's your friendly neighborhood government, who, of course, can print money to pay for it with. Anyway, so the Democrats, basically, that's one of their platforms. The Republicans don't openly state it, but they have done not too much to stop it so far. And hopefully there is hope in the Republican Party. Maybe the Libertarians will get organized enough to get us back to
I wouldn't hold my breath on the Libertarian.
Yeah, no, their organization is not what the Libertarians do. And unfortunately, it requires organization to basically, stop this whole juggernaut. Well, we were going to talk about antidepressants, right? And some people to this day say, I wouldn't let my kids be on antidepressants. Oh, my gosh. And they do all of this, and they get all upset. And again, about, 6 years ago, I gave a talk in China, and got a chance to get a little feel for Chinese medicine. I remember going into a restaurant where in the middle of summer, this was in July, and it was plenty warm out in Beijing, and we went into a restaurant, and there were 5 hat check, coat check people in the middle of July. I go, huh? What? So I asked our guide, why do they have 5 coat check people? And I don't have a coat. Nobody has a coat, but you got 5 coat check people here. So he went back, and he came back, and he explained that, in China, everyone is employed. And because people get depressed and they can't make it to work because they're too depressed, what they do is they hire 5 people for the one position of coat checker in there. And all 5 of them were feeling pretty good and made it to work today. Yeah. Normally they have 1 or none.
Right, yeah,
and,
but then all 5 showed up.
All 5 showed up because they were feeling pretty good. Well, in China, they do not treat depression. You get your job, and you get a menial job, and if you're feeling better, you make it to work, and if you don't, well, you don't.
We'll see you when you come in.
Yeah, and here in America, you go see your doctor, you're depressed, you're not sleeping well, your moods are down, you're feeling suicidal, you're not eating well, you're losing weight, you've got no energy, you're fatigued, you've got no pleasure in your life, you don't enjoy the things you used to enjoy. Your doctor, if you tell him about this stuff, is going to give you an antidepressant. And guess what? You go to work. And I think that the antidepressants are a big part of why Americans today are the most productive people on the planet. Absolutely the most productive. But you get a little attacks. Now, I saw this thing on Celexa, and, I was prescribe Celexa frequently for older folks, really in part to cause neurogenesis or new nerve cell growth in elderly folks. But it also helps bring up the mood. And about 3-4 years ago, the FDA jumped on the bandwagon of how dangerous the antidepressants are, and they started creating a panic about giving Celexa because it caused QT interval prolongation. That means if you get a cardiogram, and you read the cardiogram, a couple of little squiggles, the Q wave and the T wave, they're a little further apart. And that in cardiology parlance can be associated with certain types of arrhythmia like VTAC and VFib and sudden death.
So heart problems.
Yeah, you could suddenly drop dead if you took Celexa, you had a prolonged QT interval, and lo and behold, you don't show up because you're dead for your next appointment, that is. And so they've been pushing this, and they've got the pharmacists all up on a Twitter, and everybody's all upset about it. And I kept saying, well, show me the numbers of actual deaths, not the numbers of QT interval
But
prolongation.
Show me the deaths.
Yeah, because what they're doing is they're using what's called a marker, and this has become popular at FDA. So the QT interval prolongation is a marker that they could be subject to sudden death. Well, I came across a nice little article in a journal I used to be an editor on, the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry. Came out last year. They reviewed over 50,000 cases of Celexa. And, the criteria they were looking for was not prolonged QT interval. The criteria they were looking for is how many sudden deaths are there? And the answer was no more than you would find in the general population or from Prozac or from any of the other SSRIs. And it's the, adjusted same as the normal population. So you might have a prolonged QT interval. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to then have a sudden death episode any more than the average population. Meanwhile, because of the scare, there was another article that I came across in one of my favorite journals, the Journal of the American Geriatric Society, and that one did a 3-year study of VA populations at the University of Michigan, and they found that basically the docs and the nurse practitioners are ignoring the FDA black box warning about QT interval because they don't order EKGs to follow up after they, have prescribed their Celexa. So, I don't know. Here we have this governmental agency telling us what to do, and the people don't do it. But what's the actual outcome? Well, the outcome is there aren't any more people dropping dead from Celexa than otherwise, but they did create a little scare about it. It's like, you remember when they declared milk to be unsafe and eggs were unsafe and what else was unsafe? Everything was unsafe, And then they come back and say, well, no, eggs are okay, Well, here's another one. You remember lard was unsafe, and so McDonald's stopped doing their French fries in lard. Yeah, lard is safe. It's always been safe. It's the fatty acid of lard is actually healthier for you than, for example, margarine.
That's right. And it was another one, I think it was like cornstarch was another one that was really, the MSGs, I think that's what it was.
Oh,
MSG,
yes.
That's the big one that I always knew. That I remember I used to put MSG on, I used to put the seasoning on everything, popcorn, food, everything.
Yeah, steak.
And then I was told that, oh no, this is bad, it's dangerous, this will cause heart attack, this will kill you. So I stopped doing it, and then I came across a study a couple months ago that basically said from all sorts of health guys and all sorts of different researchers that are like, yeah, it was a hoax. This is not. It's actually not. It's not bad for you. In fact, it's actually healthier for you than a lot of other seasonings that you regularly use. You have an entire cuisine, Asian food. They use MSG in just about everything, and they have far lower health problems in some of those places than Americans do. I thought that was very interesting.
Well, the discovery of that was by a guy I know at Washington University when I was there. And John Olney, he still is doing research. Saw him at the neuroscience meetings a couple of years ago. But anyway, John was a guy, he became quite famous. I think he was written up in Newsweek because he discovered what are called excitotoxins in the brain. And MSG was a big one. It caused GABA neurons to go off, and they were, basically toxic to the brain. And so he presented at Grand Rounds one time when I was a resident. And we had this guy who was the chairman of the department who had a bad case of multiple sclerosis, was in a wheelchair, but basically he was the smartest man in the room. And so John elegantly, showed how he discovered GABA and inhibition and how the GABA is an excitatory neurotoxin. And by golly, we got to all avoid MSG. And so at the end, he said, are there any questions? And Eli Robbins, who was my chairman, the guy in the wheelchair, raised his voice. He said, well, I only have one question, John. He said, if this MSG is so toxic, how come there's so many smart Chinese on the planet? And Oli just sat there, and, The look on his face was precious.
What response did he get?
Yeah, he didn't. He had no response. And to this day, he has no response for that.
Well, because
you
what
just
can you
made
say?
the observation yourself. The Chinese thrive on this stuff, and so you have to be careful about it. There are some health warnings that
Certainly.
probably are real, like don't eat arsenic. That's a good thing. And I don't think pizza is ever going to make it back from the list. Pizza will never be a health food, no matter what Wolfgang Puck puts on it. It just, it's the magic bad combination. French fries will probably be on the no list forever. But no, these things are fun to work with. And, I think the thing people need to do is use reason. And they do. It's like, you don't panic on doing EKGs on everybody, which is not an inexpensive procedure. But doing EKGs on everybody you prescribe Celexa for, that's silly. There'll be certain cases where you have some concerns, prior heart attack, something like that. You focus on those folks. But you don't just do it on everybody because it runs the cost up. Also, it scares the patients and everything else. So, yeah. Wow. Let's see here. Oh, we were going to talk about neuroscience discoveries. This is a pretty
here
picture.
we go.
You see this?
Yes. Is that a brain?
That
I'm looking
is
at
every connection in a brain. That is an entire brain, one slice here. But isn't that pretty?
Yes, that's
you can
fantastic.
actually magnify that and see each connection of every neuron in that brain.
Wow.
Yeah. Do you know what that brain is? That's a fruit fly brain.
That's the brain of a fruit fly.
Yes.
Okay.
And there that comes.